Jinnah of Pakistan by Stanley Warpert. Chapter 2 Bombay 1896 to 1910. Jinnah was enrolled as a barrister in Bombay's High Court on August 24, 1896, precisely one decade after the Karachi country boy was first driven past that Victorian palace of law. He richly variegated London experiences, tempered by the traumas of his brief return home, had made a man of him. He was bereft of mother and wife. His most powerful ties to Karachi had been cut with surgical finality. Muhammad Ali Jinnah, Esquire, born out of the bitter disappointment and pain that shrouded his last few months, was launched into orbit of his own. For Bombay, as for Jinnah personally, it was a time of tragedy and mourning. Bubonic plague from China had reached that busy port in the autumn of 1896. The Black Death that claimed millions of Indian lives in the ensuing decade remained most severe in crowded, bustling cities of Bombay, Pune, and Ahmedabad, at least until the ingenious Dr. W. M. Haffkine, 1860 to 1930, developed his vaccine in 1899. Jinnah's preoccupation with cleanliness, scrubbing his hands many times daily at almost obsessive length, seems to date from his pre-Haffkine era, when the only known antidotes to the Black Death were soap, water, and whitewash. His lifelong obsession with clean, meticulous dress, as well as personal hygiene and privacy, seemed rather more sensible than surprising, given the humid heat and health hazards prevalent in Bombay, especially at this time. Jinnah rented a reasonable room in the Apollo Railway Hotel on Charni Road, within walking distance of the High Court, where he spent most of his days auditing the advocacy of others and awaiting his first client. Virtually nothing is known of the young barrister's first 3 years in practice. By 1900, however, his professional promise was held in high esteem by a most influential friend who introduced him to the Bombay's acting Advocate General, John Molesworth Macpherson. The latter took immediate liking to young Jinnah and invited him to work in his office. It was the first such invitation Macpherson ever extended to an Indian. Sarojini Naidu, one of Jinnah's most devoted friends, recalled, Macpherson's confidence and support came as a beacon of hope at a low point in Jinnah's early struggles to establish himself. Auntie Manbai Pirbhoy, her husband, and their circle of friends assisted him socially, of course, and having come through Lincoln's Inn gave him the proper credentials, but Macpherson did for Jinnah's legal career what Croft had done for his life, removed it from the humdrum realm of local competition to a more exalted plateau of power and possibility. In Macpherson's chambers, Jinnah had access to information long before it reached the ears of penurious pleaders plodding through dim corridors of the court. Within a few months of going to work for Macpherson, he learned, for example, that one of Bombay's 4 magistracies, a municipal judgeship, was about to fall vacant. His response to the acquisition of this valuable news offers a glimpse of young Jinnah in action, gazing through the window and smoking a cigarette. In the Advocate General's office, Jinnah saw a Victoria cab slowly passing by, rushed outside and jumped into it and drove straight to the office of Sir Charles Ollivant. Sir Charles was then judicial member of the provincial government of Bombay and found Macpherson's handsome, ambitious young assistant so impressive that he hired him to serve as temporary third presidency magistrate. Jinnah sat for 6 months on the municipal bench, hearing every sort of petty criminal case, from charges brought against 2 Muslims, opium eaters from Basra, of concealing their dope under their turbans, to complaints by the Great Indian Peninsular Railway brought against riders accused of failing to pay any fare, to accusations against ordinary Chinese seamen for refusing to work on their ships while in port. Jinnah proved himself fair and fearless as a judge, but found the bench a much less attractive professional prospect than the bar. Was it the pugnacity of youth that made advocacy more fascinating for him, or the lure of more lucrative rewards? Fame as well as fortune went to great barristers, of course, and Jinnah longed for both. When Sir Charles offered him a permanent place on the bench, therefore, at the perfectly respectable starting salary of 1500 rupees a month in 1901, Jinnah declined, replying, "I will soon be able to earn that much in a single day." As soon he did. The dawn of the Edwardian era, coinciding with that of the 20th century, found Jinnah firmly established in his chosen career, earning enough money to rent a new office. He spared no expense to furnish that elegant and attractive chamber, his sister recalled, in a manner which any lawyer would have been proud to call his own. Jinnah Bhai Poonja's health had declined with his business fortune, and so the old man moved with his remaining children to Bombay, renting a small house in Khwaja district of Khajak. Jinnah appears not to have seen much of his father in this interlude, however, and by 1904, Jinnah Bhai moved off to Bombay's Ratnagiri coast, where he spent his final years in quiet retirement. The only sibling with whom Jinnah established a close, continuing relationship was Fatima, who enrolled as a boarding student in Bombay's Bandra Convent School thanks to her brother's munificent support. Mission schools were still the best primary and secondary centers of education in India at this time, and because of her excellent early education, Fatma was able to gain admission to the highly competitive University of Calcutta, where she attended the dental school. Jinnah visited his adoring sister on Sundays, taking her for carriage rides around Bombay, which she learned to love as much as her brother. Almost as tall and lean as he, Fatma's appearance was an arresting replica of her brother's. The noble brow as high, the cheekbones as prominent, the luminous eyes as wide and probing, and the hair initially as warm and raven black would later become just as coldly white. Religion never played an important role in Jinnah's life, except for its political significance. He left the Agha Khan's Sevenar Khwaja community at this stage of his maturation, opting instead to join the less hierarchically structured Ithna Ashari sect of 12 Khwajas, who acknowledged no leader. One of Jinnah's most admired Bombay friends, Justice Badruddin Tayyib Ji, 1844 to 1906, first Muslim High Court judge and third president of the Indian National Congress, was an Ishna Ashari. Tayyib Ji, like Jinnah, was a secular liberal modernist who argued in his presidential address to the Madras Congress, "I, for one, am utterly at a loss to understand why Muslims should not work shoulder to shoulder with their fellow countrymen of other races and creeds for the common benefit of all. This is the principle on which we in the Bombay Presidency have always acted." Jinnah's other closest friends and admired elders in Bombay were Parsis, Hindus, and Christians, none of whom took their respective religions as seriously as their faith in British law and Indian nationalism. Most of the leaders of the 1/4 of British India's population that adhered to Islam, however, were either Orthodox Sunni fundamentalists who continued to look to the Quran and prophetic practices as their twin sources of appropriate daily behavior, or modernist disciples of Sir Syed Abrad Khan, 1817 to 1898, who rejected Congress's claim to institutional direction of a single united Indian national movement as vigorously as they denied Islamic orthodoxy's infallibility. In 1875, a decade before the Indian National Congress was founded, Sir Syed started his potent Mohammedan Anglo-Oriental College at Aligarh, some 60 miles southeast of Delhi. Modeled on the Oxbridge residential and tutorial collegiate system, Aligarh taught generations of wealthy young Muslim males of British India Western science, moral philosophy, and the dual virtue of loyalty to the British Raj as well as to Islam. Aligarh's cricket fields and common rooms served as the breeding ground for Muslim League. Sir Syed himself, knighted in 1870, devoted his mature life to the service in the British Empire. Appointed by the Viceroy to his Imperial Legislative Council, Sir Syed argued from that powerful platform in 1883 against the introduction of the principle of election, pure and simple, into the body politic of a country like India where caste distinctions still flourish, where there is no fusion of the various races, where religious distinctions are still violent. A decade later, he denounced the aims and objectives of Congress as based upon ignorance of history and present day realities. They do not take into consideration that India is inhabited by different nationalities. They presuppose that the Muslims, like the Marhatas, the Brahmins, the Kshatriyas, can all be treated alike and all of them belong to the same nation. That was the earliest modern articulation of the two-nation theory, which was to become the ideological basis for Pakistan. Barrister Jinnah of Bombay remained as remote from such feeling, as out of tune with such reasoning, as he had been in London in 1893 when Sir Syed first spoke of Hindus and Muslims as different nationalities. Jinnah's universe at this time was the law, though his singular success as an advocate was not unrelated to his acting talent. He was what God made him. A fellow barrister of Bombay's High Court put it, a great pleader. He had a sixth sense. He could see around corners, that is, where his talents lay. He was a very clear thinker, but he drove his points home, points chosen with exquisite selection, slow delivery, word by word. Another contemporary noted when he stood up in court, slowly looking towards the judge, placing his monocle in his eye, with a sense of timing you would expect from an actor. He became omnipotent. Yes, that is the word, omnipotent. Joachim Alva said he cast a spell on the courtroom, head erect, unruffled by the worst circumstances. He has been our boldest advocate. Jinnah's most famous legal apprentice, M.C. Chagla, the first Indian Muslim appointed Chief Justice of Bombay's High Court, reminisced that his leader's presentation of a case was nothing less than a piece of art. In politics, Jinnah's heroes remained Dadabhai Naoroji and another brilliant leader of Bombay's Parsi community, Sir Firoz Shah Mehta, 1845 to 1915, in whose chambers he worked for some time during this early interlude. Mehta presided over the Congress in 1890 and stressed the role of all minorities in India's nation-building process. To my mind, a Parsi is a better and a truer Parsi, as a Mohammedan or a Hindu is a better and truer Mohammedan or Hindu, the more he is attached to the land which gave him birth. Sir Firoz Shah insisted, is it possible to imagine that Dadabhai Naoroji, for instance, true Parsi that he is anything but an Indian? Can anyone doubt, if I may be allowed to take another illustration, that Sir Syed Ahmad Khan was greater and nobler when he was devoting the great energies and talents with which he is endowed for the benefit of all Indians in general, than when, as of late, he was preaching a gospel of selfishness and isolation. Mehta was India's first Parsi barrister called to the bar from Lincoln's Inn in 1868 and served as a member of Bombay's Municipal Corporation for 46 years, 4 times in its chair. Elegant, imperious, a fierce advocate hailed as uncrowned king of Bombay. Sir Firoz Shah was more the Bombay model of Jinnah's early career than Dadabhai. In 1890, he labeled the supposed rivalry between Hindus and Muslims nothing more than a convenient decoy to distract attention and to defer the day of reform. Young Jinnah felt much the same way. The first annual session of Congress attended by Jinnah was its 20th, held under canvas on Bombay's Oval in December 1904. Sir Firoz Shah chaired the reception committee, his welcoming remarks taking longer than Sir Henry Cotton's entire presidential address, indicative of their relative position within the Congress as well as their rhetorical styles. Responding to Viceroy Lord Curzon's patronizing advice, I do not think that the salvation of India is to be sought in the fields of politics. Mehta asked, how can these aspirations and desires be even gradually achieved unless we are allowed to play at all times a modest and temperate part on the field of politics? Surely not through the dubious labors of British India's secret and irresponsible bureaucracy, argued Mehta, agreeing with Walter Bagehot that all bureaucracy tended to under-government in point of quality and over-government in the point of quantity. Mehta proposed that two of his trusted disciples from Bombay be sent as Congress deputies to London the following year to lobby what he and other well-informed observers of Britain's political climate correctly anticipated would be the new Liberal government in Westminster and Whitehall. His choices for so important a task were Gopal Krishna Gokhale, 1866 to 1915, and Muhammad Ali Jinnah. Mahatma, great soul, Gokhale, who was to preside over the next session of Congress, seemed an obvious choice to everyone, but Jinnah was still unknown to most Congress delegates, and enough questions were raised to hold up release of any funds for his passage. He did, however, sail to England with Gokhale 8 years later, when both were appointed to the same Royal Commission. The 1904 Congress was Jinnah's first meeting with Gokhale, whose wisdom, fairness, and moderation he came to admire, so that he soon stated his fond ambition in politics was to become the Muslim Gokhale. Jinnah's involvement in Congress politics was as integral a byproduct of his flourishing legal career and social life in Bombay as his earlier commitment to Dadabhai had been in London. Lord Curzon's paternalistic viceroyalty helped to stimulate growing political impatience among India's swiftly expanding pool of educated young men, fired with the liberty-loving ideals of British literature, while faced with the depressing realities of Indian unemployment, political dependence, and abysmal poverty. Internationally, 1905 was a year of revolutionary surprises. Japan's electrifying victory over Russia's Titanic fleet, the Petersburg Revolution that moved the Tsar to appoint a representative Duma, the Chinese boycott of British goods in many port cities, and Britain's turbulent national election that ushered in a decade of Liberal Party rule in London sent shockwaves of excitement throughout the Indian subcontinent. Internally, the most dramatic and far-reaching act during Lord Curzon's half-decade of viceregal rule was the partition of Bengal, British India's premier province. Population of over 85 million, Bengal was certainly unwieldy to administer, but the line drawn to divide it ran through the Bengali-speaking nation of that sprawling province, dividing it predominantly Hindu Bengali speakers in the west from the mostly poorer Muslim Bengali speakers east of Calcutta. A new Muslim majority province, Eastern Bengal and Assam, was created with its capital in Dhaka. West Bengal, administered from Calcutta, continued to have a Hindu majority but contained so many Bihari and Oriya speaking people that it no longer had a Bengali speaking Hindu majority. Calcutta's Bengali Hindu elite, who had been Curzon's loudest critics since 1903, viewed this partition of their motherland as British divide et impera with a vengeance. The half-decade of violent anti-partition agitation that started in Calcutta's crowded bazaars and narrow alleys spread fires of national protests and boycott against British goods across India to ignite Bombay, Pune, Madras and Lahore. Millions of Indians, hitherto untouched by political demands, were politicized by the impassioned anti-government speeches and actions of Bengal's revolutionaries, who left British classrooms by the thousands to march through Calcutta's streets, singing the Congress's new anthem, Bande Mataram, Hail to Thee, Mother, with clenched fists held high. Jinnah personally voiced no traceable reaction to Bengal's first partition, though the political impact of its explosive aftershock was to change his life as much as it altered the map of India. As a Congress moderate, friend and disciple, he must have agreed, however, with President Gokhal's characterization of partition as a cruel wrong, a complete illustration of the worst features of the present system of bureaucratic rule, its utter contempt for public opinion, its arrogant pretensions to superior wisdom, its reckless disregard of the most cherished feelings of the people. As a Bombay Muslim, however, Jinnah was perhaps most remote among all subsets of Indian nationalists from the feelings of outrage and betrayal shared by so many Bengali Hindus. He well understood, of course, how shrewd a British political move this was, weaning Bengali Muslims from dependence on Calcutta's landlord and money, lending as well as political Hindu leadership, exalting sleepy little Dhaka to equal provincial status with Calcutta, Bombay and Madras. That first partition ignited Muslim political consciousness throughout the subcontinent, providing a provincial cradle in Dhaka for the birth of Muslim League in 1906. Curzon's successor, Lord Minto, 1845 to 1914, was also a Tory entrenched in Calcutta shortly before the British general elections that would dispose his party from power in London for the next decade. Paradoxically, British India's Liberal Secretary of State, John Morley, contributed as much as Minto did to dividing the empire he ruled from 1906 to 1910 by promising, for the noblest of reasons, to initiate parliamentary constitutional reforms soon after he took Whitehall's helm. Morley's council reforms, intended to liberalize and expand the base of secular representative popular government throughout India, planted the seeds of religious partition in the heart of British India's emerging constitution. On October 1st, 1906, 35 Muslims of noble birth, wealth and power from every province of British India and several princely states gathered in the regal ballroom of the Viceroy's Simla Palace in the Himalayas. The fourth Earl of Minto, an avid horseman named Mr. Raleigh, entered precisely at 11 a.m. The Aga Khan introduced each of his fellow deputies to the Viceroy, and then Lord Minto read aloud the address, which was printed on vellum and had earlier been sent to his secretary, J. R. Dunlop Smith, 1858 to 1921. The address contained a warning that the Mohammedans of India have always placed implicit reliance on the sense of justice and love of fair dealing that have characterized their rulers, and have in consequence abstained from pressing their claims by methods that might prove at all embarrassing, but earnestly as we desire that the Mohammedans of India should not in the future depart from that excellent and time honored tradition. Recent events have stirred up feelings, especially among the younger generation of Mohammedans, which might, in certain circumstances and under certain contingencies, easily pass beyond the control of temperate counsel and sober guidance. The ominous implications of that warning were lost upon the Viceroy or his staff. We hope Your Excellency will pardon our stating at the outset that representative institutions of the European type that are new to the Indian people, many of the most thoughtful members of our community, in fact, considered that the greatest care, forethought, and caution will be necessary if they are to be successfully adapted to the social, religious, and political conditions obtaining in India, and that in the absence of such care and caution, their adoption is likely, among other evils, to place our national interests at the mercy of an unsympathetic majority. This was the first use of the words national interests by Indian Muslims in appealing to the British rulers for help against the unsympathetic Hindu majority. The address went on to spell out Muslims' hopes for the more positions within every branch of the government service, arguing, "We Mohammedans are a distinct community with additional interests of our own, which are not shared by other communities, and these have hitherto suffered from the fact that they have not been adequately represented. We therefore pray that the government will be graciously pleased to provide that both in the gazetted, the subordinate and ministerial services of all Indian provinces, a due portion of Mohammedans shall always find place. Thanks to increased educational opportunity, the number of qualified Mohammedans has increased, but the efforts of Mohammedan educationists have from the very outset of the educational movement among them been strenuously directed towards the development of character, and this we venture to think is of greater importance than mere mental alertness in the making of a good public servant. Separate seats for Muslims were requested to be reserved on viceregal and provincial councils, high court benches, municipalities, as well as on university senates and syndicates. The deputation received a hearty welcome from Minto. He praised Aligarh and its student body, strong in the tenets of their own religion, strong in the precepts of loyalty and patriotism. He congratulated the deputation for the loyalty and common sense and sound reasoning so eloquently expressed in your address. He also thanked the Muslims of Eastern Bengal and Assam for the moderation and self-restraint they have shown in the wake of partition, promising them they could rely as firmly as ever on British justice and fair play. Since he shared none of Morley's deep-rooted liberal democratic convictions and was a conservative landlord himself, Minto assured his aristocratic audience that I should be very far from welcoming all the political machinery of the Western world amongst the hereditary instincts of Eastern races. Finally, Minto announced that any electoral representation in India would be doomed to mischievous failure, which aimed at granting a personal enfranchisement regardless of the beliefs and traditions of the communities composing of the population of this continent. The Mohammedan community may rest assured that their political rights and interests as a community will be safeguarded by any administrative reorganization with which I am concerned. Viceroy's remarks were greeted with murmurs of satisfaction and cries of "Hear, hear" from the delighted deputation. At a garden tea party that afternoon, delegates assured Lady Minto that now we feel the Viceroy is our friend. Minto and Dunlop Smith considered it a most important day's work, and it was probably the latter who told her ladyship that evening that he viewed it as nothing less than pulling back of 62 millions of people from joining the ranks of the seditious opposition. Kolkata's leading nationalist newspaper, Amrita Bazar Patrika, reported the deputation and its reception as a got-up affair fully engineered by interested officials to whitewash their doings. The authorities wanted a few simple-minded men of position to give them a certificate of good conduct. They knew the Hindus would not do it, so they began operation among the older classes of Musalmans. Both assessments were exaggerated, though the deputation did win the promise of separate electorates for Muslims, a major historic landmark on the road to Pakistan. From the nucleus of that Simla deputation, however, the Muslim League would be born before the year's end. Jinnah, who had so recently quit the Aga Khan's Ismaili fold, had nothing to do with the Muslim deputation or its historic Dhaka aftermath. In November, Salimullah Khan, the leading landowner of Dhaka, whose vast holdings won him the title Nawab, invited Aligarh's Mohammedan Educational Conference to Dhaka for its annual meeting, suggesting at the same time that a Muslim All-India Confederacy be convened in his city. The Nawab of Dhaka had been sick during the Simla meeting but chaired the reception committee for the founding meeting of the Muslim Leagues in Dhaka's Shah Bagh, Royal Garden, on December 30th, 1906. Sleepy Dhaka's backwater then suddenly emerged as the center of South Asian Muslim politics, hosting 58 Muslim delegates from every corner of the subcontinent. The Musalmans are only a fifth in number as compared with the total population of the country, noted the Muslim League's first president, Nawab Mushtaq Hussain, 1841 to 1917 of Hyderabad. And it is manifest that if at any remote period the British government ceases to exist in India, then the rule of India would pass into the hands of that community, which is nearly 4 times as large as ourselves. Now, gentlemen, let each of us consider what will be your condition if such a situation is created in India. Then our life, our property, our honor and our faith will all be in great danger. When even now that a powerful British administration is protecting its subjects, we the Musalmans have to face most serious difficulties in safeguarding our interests from the grasping hands of our neighbors. Woe betide the time when we become the subjects of our neighbors. And to prevent the realization of such aspirations on the part of our neighbors, the Musalmans cannot find better and surer means than to congregate under the banner of the Great Britain and to devote their lives and property in its protection. Thus, founded by conservative loyalist Muslim nobility, frank in their confession that British imperial protection was indispensable to their continued well-being, if not sheer survival, the Muslim League emerged without stated nationalist ambitions. It is through regard for our own lives and property, our own honor and religion, that we are impelled to be faithful to the government. Our own prosperity is bound up with and depends upon our loyalty to the British rule in India. President Hussain frankly admitted he was, after all, reared in the autocratic service of the Nizam of Hyderabad, who permitted no political agitation, tolerated no dissent. I do not hesitate in declaring that unless the leaders of the Congress make sincere efforts as speedily as possible to quell the hostility against the government and the British race, the necessary consequence of all that is being openly done and said today will be the sedition that would be rampant, and the Musalmans of India would be called upon to perform the necessary duty of combating this rebellious spirit side by side with the British government more effectively than by the mere use of words. Nawab Samiullah Khan moved 4 resolutions in Dhaka, all carried unanimously, creating the Muslim League. Destined to remain Muslim, India's major political organization, emerging in less than 4 decades as standard bearer of Pakistan. The League was created to protect and advance the political rights and interests of the Muslims of India and to respectfully represent their needs and aspirations to the government. The Nawab of Dhaka called it a turning of a corner of the course set 2 decades earlier by Sir Syed Ahmad Khan when he founded his Mohammedan Educational Conference. The Aga Khan was elected first honorary president of the Muslim League, though he did not attend the Dhaka inaugural session and later thought it was freakishly ironic that our doughtiest opponent in 1906 was Jinnah, who came out in bitter hostility towards all that I and my friends had done and were trying to do. He was the only well-known Muslim to take this attitude. He said that our principle of separate electorates was dividing the nation against itself. Jinnah had joined 44 other like-minded Muslims in neighboring Calcutta meeting together with some 1500 Hindus, Parsis and Christians at the 1906 annual session of Congress. Dadabhai Naoroji presided with Jinnah serving as his secretary. Old Dadabhai was too weak to read the address himself that Jinnah had helped write, so Gokhale read it for him, beginning with several quotations. One from Liberal Prime Minister Campbell Bannerman called for self-government. Good government could never be a substitute for the government by the people themselves. And as practical immediate step towards attainment of this goal, the Dadabhai Gokhale Jinnah address earnestly called for the employment of more Indians in every branch of the services to help eliminate the threefold wrong inflicted on India by retaining so many British officers, depriving us of wealth, work and wisdom, of everything in short worth living for. Alteration of the services from European to Indian is the keynote of the whole. Coordinately, education must be most vigorously disseminated among the people. Free and compulsory primary education and free higher education of every kind. Education on the one hand and actual training in the administration on the other hand will bring the accomplishment of self-government far more speedily than many imagine. Dadabhai's speech, replete with quotes from Morley, included one equating the sacred word free with the noblest aspirations that can animate the breast of man. Such were the feelings and aspirations animating Jinnah as he celebrated his 30th birthday from the platform of India's National Congress. The speech called the Bengal partition a bad blunder for England, but one Dadabhai hoped may yet be rectified through agitation, and addressing himself to the growing distance between Hindus and Muslims in the aftermath of partition, Dadabhai called for a thorough political union among the Indian people of all creeds and classes. I appeal to the Indian people for this because it is in their own hands. They have in them the capacity, energy and intellect to hold their own and to get their due share in all walks of life, of which the state services are but a small part. State services are not everything. Once self-government is attained, then will there be prosperity enough for all, but not till then. The thorough union, therefore, of all people for their emancipation is an absolute necessity. They must sink to or swim together. Without this union, all efforts will be in vain. This theme of national unity was to be echoed by Jinnah at every political meeting he attended during the ensuing decade, in which he emerged as India's true ambassador of Hindu-Muslim unity. Jinnah first met India's poetess Sarojini Naidu at that Calcutta Congress, when he was already accounted a rising lawyer and a coming politician, fired, as she recalled, by a virile patriotism. She was instantly captivated by his stunning appearance and rare and complex temperament, and has left a most insightful portrait of young Jinnah. Tall and stately, but thin to the point of emaciation, languid and luxurious of habits. Muhammad Ali Jinnah's attenuated form is a deceptive sheath of a spirit of exceptional vitality and endurance, somewhat formal and fastidious, and a little aloof and imperious of manner. The calm hauteur of his accustomed reserve but masks, for those who know him, a naive and eager humanity, an intuition quick and tender as a woman's, a humor gay and winning as a child's, preeminently rational and practical, discreet and dispassionate in his estimate and acceptance of life. The obvious sanity and serenity of his worldly wisdom effectually disguise a shy and splendid idealism which is of the very essence of the man. Jinnah left Calcutta inspired with his mission of advancing the cause of Hindu-Muslim unity, perceiving as few of his contemporaries did how indispensable such unity was to the new goal of Swaraj, self-government, that Congress had adopted. He was politician enough to realize, of course, that his only hope of succeeding his liberal mentors and friends, Dadabhai, Firoz Shah and Gokhale as leaders of Congress was by virtue of his secular constitutional national appeal, not through his double minority status. He had risen above all parochial roots and provincial prejudice, a Shakespearean hero in modern garb, with the noblest imprecations of Burke, Mill and Morley ringing in his mind, stirring his heart. Congress's national political platform had become his new dramatic stage, grander and more exciting than Bombay's High Court. In one short decade after returning from London, he had virtually emerged as heir apparent to the Bombay triumvirate, which led Congress's slow-moving political bullock cart toward the promised land of freedom. A more militant revolutionary faction within Congress, led by Maharashtra's Lokmanya, friend of the people, Bal Gangadhar Tilak, 1858 to 1920, and Bengal's fiery Bipin Chandra Pal, 1858 to 1932, competed, however, by then with the moderate old guard for the control of India's premier nationalist organization. Though Tilak and Gokhale both started as Pune colleagues in public education and national service, they differed fundamentally in many ways, especially with respect to political tactics and philosophy. The Lokmanya and his new party had no faith in Morley's promised reforms, rejecting reliance on pleas and petitions to the British officialdom for anything. Boycott was their battle cry, first of British machine-made cloth and other manufactured imports, later of all British institutions including schools, courts and council chambers. The other side of their economic plank of boycott was Swadeshi, of our own country, stimulating indigenous Indian industry, especially cotton cloth woven and spun both by hand and machine. They made Swaraj their goal, but the self-rule they demanded was not that of British citizens but of totally independent Indians. The symbols popularized by Tilak in rousing the mass following he won among mostly illiterate peasants and urban workers were drawn from the religious ocean of Hinduism and regional lore, and usually served to alienate Muslim and other minorities as it won Hindu adherents. British officials on the spot vainly tried harsher techniques of repression to silence this mounting opposition. Pills for the earthquake, Morley called that method of dealing with nationalism. The most popular leaders were arrested and deported, including a new martyr from the Punjab, Lala Lajpat Rai, 1865 to 1928, who became a hero as soon as he was arrested in the spring of 1907 and shipped off to Mandalay prison. The new party immediately proposed Lajpat Rai as their candidate for the next president of Congress. Firoz Shah and Gokhale had their own candidate, however, the mild-mannered, moderate Calcutta educator Dr. Rash Bihari Ghosh. The fractional split that left Congress torn apart for almost a decade exploded at the session in Surat in 1907, next to Bombay, which had so recently hosted the Congress. Surat was the strongest bastion of moderate leadership power, Gujarat's center of mercantile wealth. Sir Firoz Shah felt confident that he could keep the peace and control of his organization in the port of Surat. He had, however, underestimated the passion and stubbornness of Tilak and his followers. As Rash Bihari Ghosh moved towards the rostrum inside the Congress Pandal to read his presidential address, Tilak rose to shout, "Point of order." He had indicated earlier his intention of introducing Lajpat Rai's candidacy from the Congress floor. No one on the platform recognized him, however. Yet, that did not stop the Kamanya. He mounted the platform himself and headed for the rostrum. Several tough guards moved to intercept Tilak, but Gokhale warded them off, jumping to his old colleague's defense and protectively extending his own arms around Tilak's body. Most of the delegates were on their feet, shouting and gesturing. A stiff Melisliaristrian slipper was then tossed vigorously onto the stage, hitting both Firozishali and Bengal's venerable Surendranath Banerjee. Panic and pandemonium ensued. The tent had to be cleared by police and hired guards. For the next 9 years, Congress remained divided into angrily conflicting moderate and revolutionary parties, each claiming to be the sole rightful heir to India's national movement. In the wake of the Surat split, revolutionary violence and official repressions intensified. Tilak was arrested in the summer of 1908, charged with seditious writings for several editorials published in his popular Pune newspaper, Kesari. Tilak represented himself before the High Court in Bombay, but immediately after his arrest, when he was held without bail, he secured the services of Jinnah to plead for his release pending trial. Jinnah argued valiantly but to no avail, for British justice had closed its mind to Tilak long before his trial began. And although Jinnah's argument fell on deaf ears, it attests at once to his brilliance as a barrister and the strength of his national leadership potential. A pettier man might have found some excuse for refusing to plead on behalf of the leader of a political party opposing his own. Jinnah, however, not only stood up for Tilak at this juncture, but defending him on another charge of sedition in 1916 and won, thus earning the gratitude as well as affectionate admiration of Hindu India's foremost conservative leader. The Legislative Council reforms proposed by Morley and Minto initially provided for 4 separately elected Muslim members on expanded Imperial Council of the Viceroy. By the time the Indian Council's bill was finished in 1909, however, no fewer than 6 such seats were reserved on a central legislative council of 60, more than half of whom remained British officials. Minto, moreover, had promised to appoint at least 2 additional Muslim members as nominees of his own bat if they were not elected by special constituencies such as landholders or municipalities, raising Muslim membership to 8 out of the 28 non-official members on the Viceroy's Council, more than the actual ratio of India's Muslim minority to the total population of subcontinent. By 1909, even Minto complained of the excess representation granted to Mohammedans. Morley retorted, "It was your early speech about their extra claims that started the Muslim here." The Secretary of State was by then convinced that it passes the wit of a man to frame plans that will please Hindus without offending Mohammedans, and we shall be lucky if we don't offend both. The separate electorate formula, which Jinnah initially rejected on grounds of national principle, served in fact to raise his personal consciousness of Muslim identity. Jinnah was one of the first half dozen Muslim members specially elected, in his case from Bombay, to sit on the Viceroy's Central Legislative Council in 1910. 3 years before he actually joined the Muslim League. At 35, he was one of the youngest members elected to that high council and would have stood no chance but for the fact that two much older knighted Muslim candidates, equally matched and antithetical, ousted one another in preliminary skirmishes to choose the Muslim candidate. Jinnah's secretary recalled that discussions went on for hours and in the end both of them decided that none of them should seek election but should send a third candidate, and after careful scrutiny the choice fell on the young lawyer. That singular honor catapulted Jinnah to the side of Gokhale, whose general Bombay seat had been held before him by Sir Firoz Shah. The legislative centre of India's government, first in Calcutta and Simla, later in Delhi, soon became one of Jinnah's most important and powerful stages. Morley's reforms also introduced Indian participation in British India's powerful executive council, both at Whitehall and in Calcutta, Simla. Two Indian members were appointed to the Secretary of State's Whitehall Council of India in 1907, and the first Indian to hold the post of law member of the Government of India, Satyendra P. Sinha, 1864 to 1928. Took his seat in 1909. A Hindu Brahman by birth, Sinha was, like Jinnah, a barrister and moderate Congress leader. His legal practice in 1908 was so lucrative that accepting the government's invitation meant a cut in his annual income of £10,000. Sinha's first inclination, therefore, was to turn down the Viceroy's invitation, but Jinnah and Gokhale convinced him to accept the job. His role in this matter further attests to the Jinnah's strong personal commitment to the principle of finding the candidate best qualified for any job, regardless of race, religion, caste, or creed. Muslim League leaders had lobbied for a Muslim jurist to fill that powerful position in India's central government. The League's president at its 1908 Amritsar session, Sayyid Ali Imam, 1869 to 1933, was himself a barrister of London's Middle Temple and would succeed Sinha as law member after the former resigned in November 1910, establishing the precedent of alternating Hindu-Muslim appointees and subsequent communal parity in all executive appointments. Born as the League was out of the separate electorate. Muslim affirmative action demand that organization remained most firmly committed to its founding principle, proposing names of Muslim candidates for every important official vacancy. Congress, on the other hand, always viewed this principle as anti-national and undemocratic, even as English liberals like John Morley did. Any religious register, after all, whether Muslim, Catholic, or Calvinist, was dangerously subversive to the egalitarian foundations of a modern secular nation. Barrister Jinnah believed that as much as his great bencher mentor had and was to rise in Allahabad Congress of 1910 to second a resolution strongly deprecates the expansion or application of the principle of separate communal electorates to municipalities, district boards, or other local bodies. Paradoxically, Jinnah spoke at the end of his first year as the Calcutta Council's Muslim member from Bombay.